All right, I got 11:02, maybe 11:02 and a half. So why don't we go ahead and get started, Greg? I want to welcome all our attendees for joining us today. Really appreciate you having you on board. My name is Dan Prue. I'm the General Manager with the Greater Vernon Chamber of Commerce. Pleased to be offering this town hall with our provincial opposition and joined by Greg Kyllo. I'll just give Greg a little bit of an introduction to everybody here. So Greg Kyllo was elected as MLA for Shuswap in 2013, 2017, and again in 2020. He currently serves as the Deputy Caucus Whip in the official opposition critic for Labour. Greg has served as a member of the Select Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs. He's also served as the Parliamentary Secretary for the BC Jobs Plan to the Minister of Jobs, Tourism and Skills Training, and a member of the Treasury Board Cabinet Committee on Core Review and Cabinet Committee on Strong Economy. Prior to being elected as MLA, Greg was president and CEO of Twin Anchors Marine in Sycamoose. So thank you so much, Greg, for joining us. Glad to have you here today.
Great. Well, thanks, Dan. And I really appreciate the opportunity to meet with some of your members and to find out what's top of mind for them in and around the Vernon region.
Yeah, we should say that we were going to be joined as well by Todd Stone, but he had a family matter come up, so it was really understandable that he wasn't able to join with us today. But yeah, happy to still have Greg and move through a number of issues and concerns that our members have. So Greg, I'll hand it over to you for the time being, if you'd like to start with some opening statements, and then we'll get into questions from the chamber and our members. I'll remind our members that you can submit your questions via the chat and the Q&A.
Great. Yeah, Dan, thank you very much. Again, just want to thank you very much for the opportunity, and thanks to Rich Grolke for helping to set this up. Yeah, I wanted to provide just apologies from Todd Stone. Todd's my colleague, the member for Kamloops South Thompson. He's also the critic with responsibility for small business and COVID recovery. Unfortunately, he had a family matter that came up at last minute, and so you're stuck with just me today. But certainly great to be here. As you mentioned, Dan, and for those of you that may not have met me previously, I've got a pretty significant business background. I was born and raised up in Fort St. John. When I was 10 years old, our family relocated to Sycamoose, so I've been in Sycamoose for going on 43 years now. As Dan mentioned, got involved with Twin Anchors Houseboat Vacations. I founded with my brother Todd the houseboat manufacturing division back in the early 90s. Built and manufactured probably 500 plus boats that have shipped across North America and around the globe to Russia and Puerto Rico and other destinations abroad. Diversified the company probably 15 years ago, started building camps and dorms and worker accommodation units. And then as the markets started to change, we're now finding ourselves building a lot of recreational park models, largely for the recreational park model developments in and around Shuswap and the Okanagan. So certainly know what it's like to meet a payroll. For those of you listening, I'm sure majority of members are business owners, so you know what it's like to be stuck with having to run second mortgages and to meet a payroll and all the obligations and the countless hours that looks like. I was very privileged and honored to actually run for council in the district of Sycamoose back in 2011. Sat on council for about a year and a half. And it was at that time that I met Premier Clark, and she encouraged me to seek the nomination for the BC Liberal Party in the Shuswap riding after George Abbott announced his retirement back in 2012. So certainly been a real privilege and honor to represent the hardworking men and women of the Shuswap region, which extends, for listeners that may not be familiar, the riding boundary actually goes all the way down to Swan Lake as basically the cutoff on the southern side. And the Shuswap riding heads over and goes down the west side of Okanagan Lake, almost down to Fintry. And so picks up the communities like Falkland, Sorrento, Blind Bay, and the entire North Shuswap, all the way up to like Sorrento and all the way to Seymour Arm. And then, of course, includes the communities of Sycamoose, Enderby, Grinrod, Armstrong, Spellamsheen, and the riding goes east all the way to Revelstoke, about 3 kilometers to the west of Revelstoke is kind of the perimeter of the boundary. So about 8,400 square kilometers, about 56,000 constituents, which is just above the provincial average of about 55,000, I believe is where it's sitting right now. And yeah, just just wanted to kind of share just a few thoughts. There were some stats that I thought members may be interested in learning, and this just has to do with some information that came out from the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses just over the last number of months. For you viewers that are listening and watching from home or from your businesses, you know, obviously this COVID has significantly impacted businesses across the province, specifically or more acutely with the hospitality and tourism sectors. We've been fairly fortunate, I think, in the Shuswap-Okanagan region, where we rely more heavily on regional travel than international travel. And so, I think most businesses indicated that although last year was a real challenge on many different fronts, most businesses were able to, for the most part, keep their lights on, which is a very different story from the hospitality or tourism sector in the Lower Mainland. So as you go to Lower Mainland, Vancouver, and Southern Vancouver Island, where they're a lot more dependent on international travel. Their businesses have just absolutely been decimated. Recent CEFIB survey that went out indicated that for small businesses across, and these are Canadian numbers, 73% of businesses indicated they took on additional debt associated with COVID, and 76% of businesses indicated that they'll likely have to take on additional debt over this coming year in order to look to come through some economic recovery. The average business debt is about $170,000, and total COVID-19 small business debt in Canada is estimated to be about $135 billion. So a significant amount of revenue or monies that have to be poured for businesses in order to help with this economic recovery. Some of the sectors that are a concern, I think, for CFIB, the highest amount of debt, agricultural and natural resource sectors. The average debt load for those corporations around $329,000, which is significantly above the national average of $170,000, as I mentioned earlier. The sectors with the highest percentages of debt, the hospitality sector, 91% is what they're indicating as far as the most business that are actually in debt in the country at the moment. 1 in 6 businesses still at risk of closure, and that represents about 181,000 potential businesses. So we certainly have got a lot of optimism, I think, as the vaccines are starting to roll out, but I think we're going to see our ability to recover from COVID fall behind other jurisdictions where they've had a significant higher number of vaccinations to date. And we're also seeing a bit of inequity across the country. I've got a brother who lives in Alberta, in Edmonton, and he mentioned to me about 3 weeks ago that at 60 years of age, he was able to get his COVID shot. And yet here in BC, we're just actually opening up the doors now for those 71 years and older. And so, I think we're starting to fall behind other jurisdictions in Canada, and Canada as a whole is falling behind other jurisdictions. So our economic recovery, I think, will be a little bit more stalled than we might see in other areas around the globe. There was a stat that was just shared with me here just a few weeks ago that I thought would be also interesting to know, is that the COVID pandemic is proportionally hit the private sector the hardest. Numbers are showing that we had about 83,300 job losses between February of 2020 and January of 2021. Now, this is in the private sector. At the same time, we actually grew the public sector. Public sector growth gains are indicated at 41,500 jobs. So the public sector is actually increasing growth. That represents about 5% of the provincial budget. So if you think 41,500 additional new public sector workers, like the mean average is about $80,000 per worker, that's about an extra $3.3 billion a year of additional costs that government is going to have to look after. And we all appreciate the value and the need and necessity of our public sector workforce, whether it's our nurses and our teachers and hospital care workers, those working in seniors care facilities, certainly extremely important and valuable, but there does have to be revenues in order to offset that. So the other piece that I thought was interesting is that as far as the risks, and this again is back to CFIB, they're indicating that businesses across the country, now these are Canadian statistics, and this is a report that came out over this past winter. They indicated that their estimation for business closures on the low end of the scale, 71,000. At the high end of the scale, they are estimating it could be as high as 222,000 businesses. And how that relates to actually employment numbers, The low end of the spectrum on the job losses that are potentially forecasted are 962,000, and on the high end of the spectrum, upwards of 2.3 million. With the largest risks being undertaken, obviously, with the sectors we talked about, with the hospitality, travel, arts, recreation, and a broad range of social and personal miscellaneous services. So certainly lots of concerns out there. And at that, I think maybe, Dan, I'll turn it back to you. I certainly want to see this as an exercise where we can have lots of participation from those of you that are listening in today. I'll do my best to provide some concise answers. And then if there's anything that does come up that I don't have answers for, I'm certainly happy to provide that through to the Vernon Chamber, and then they can then disseminate that information to the audience. So thanks again for this opportunity, Dan.
Yeah, no, thank you, Greg, for making yourself available, for us and our members to hear about their issues and concerns. So I want to open up the floor, obviously, if anybody has any questions or concerns that they would like to, ask Greg, then you can do so via our chat or the Q&A. I do have some prepared from the chamber here, so I will start asking and then moderate the questions as they come in. So Greg, obviously, as you know, dine-in service has been halted in restaurants until at least April 19th. What measures are needed to ensure the viability of restaurants during this period, and what needs to be done to allow them to reopen?
Yeah, so it was a bit of a surprise, I think, to all of us, especially those in the restaurant sector, to find out, early last week, the actual imminent closure of in-dining services. I think what's important is that there needs to be more clarity, and I think a bit more timing, a notification to businesses. So what I'm hearing from businesses in the area, like everybody wants to do their part to help assist us in recovering from COVID and preventing the spread. What's the challenging piece is that to make an announcement on a Monday at 1 o'clock, where businesses are actually notified that as of midnight on that same day, within 11 hours, they have to shut down. It just doesn't provide any certainty for both employees or for businesses. So many businesses are indicating that, word and references from both our chief medical officer and our premier was that we're on the right road. We're on the road to recovery. Things were looking better. Businesses felt that optimism, and many restaurateurs and bar owners actually started to increase their inventories. And then to find out on a Monday morning that things were shut down, it put them in a really tough spot. They didn't have the opportunities to actually utilize a lot of those consumables. And so it just added to the losses. If we have a look at the statistics that were being reported, we saw a fairly consistent trend 2 weeks prior to the announcement that showed that case counts were actually increasing, as well as the severity and the prevalence of the P1 variant, the Brazilian variant that apparently has significant higher transmission rates and also has higher propensity for impacting our younger demographics. So, those numbers were up. And so if you're just looking back historically, even at the data certainly didn't suggest that we were on the road to recovery and things were opening back up. So I'm not sure why there was a sudden change of course on a Monday morning. Obviously, the decision to actually look at shutting things down wouldn't have happened, in my estimation, certainly wouldn't have occurred on the Monday morning. That conversation likely was happening over the course of the weekend. And so, I think the biggest thing with the reopening is that as government looks to, combat the virus, it's also important that they provide those necessary supports. So, typically, I think it would be prudent if we're going to be looking at additional closures, which has a significant impact on the financial viability and employment of those working in the hospitality sector, that the announcement, one, should have been more timely, provided maybe 2 or 3 days advance notice so those businesses could actually utilize much of the inventory that they built up, and to provide proper notification to their staff. And then as well with that, to provide the business supports. These businesses are really struggling. They need a lifeline. As we know, the $350 million COVID restart funding program was only announced just literally days before the current government and John Horgan decided to throw us in an unnecessary and risky fall snap election. For those of you that are listening at home, may not follow a lot of the parliamentary and legislative session. Unprecedented. All parties got together in March of last year and approved a $5 billion funding package to assist government with meeting the needs and challenges of COVID. So the funding was available last March. Government took until September 18th, I believe it was, to actually announce their COVID restart program. 4 days later, throw us into a nasty snap election, and the monies haven't flowed. John Horgan, our premier, actually announced and indicated to British Columbians that there would be no delay in putting money into the hands of struggling businesses that actually needed that support. But we know that nothing could be further from the truth, and that here we are in April, 5 months after the initiative was actually announced, with only 40% of the money, only 40% of that $350 million actually have gone out the door to actually help those struggling businesses. So, certainly we support any efforts and initiatives of government to help small businesses, but it needs to be timely. And the delays have certainly not assisted businesses with having that certainty around the viability and keeping their doors open through this time.
Yeah, certainly with the reduced amount of time that businesses had to pivot, support is needed, extra support. But I want to commend all those restaurants that are out there who did pivot so quickly. I've seen it happen all around town. There's a lot of outdoor patios. So good on you. And I've seen an awful lot of support from businesses in the community as well, supporting those restaurants. When I walk into these restaurants, I have seen a lot of large orders being ordered from takeout. And I've noticed that they are from other businesses in town. So thank you so much to everybody out there who is providing that support. And to the city too. I've heard from a number of businesses who have those outdoor patios that the process to get those patios approved outside has been swift and easy. So thank you to the city for providing that as well. So moving on to another question. Employers consistently indicate that they experience challenges attracting and retaining staff. What can be done to help bridge the gap, Greg?
Yeah, so it's been a challenge, certainly not just unique to this year, but that's something that we've seen in the province over probably the last decade or so. As you mentioned, from 2013 to 2017, I served as a parliamentary secretary with responsibility for BC's jobs plan. And part of that work was identifying, where the growth opportunities were, where the skills challenges were, and then working in unison with advanced education and the ITA, the Industry Training Authority, to ensure that the necessary funding was there to help provide the necessary supports for training, our next wave of workers in the province. One of the challenges we're hearing locally, and I'm sure, Dan, you probably are hearing this in Vernon as well, despite population numbers in BC this last year being stagnant, largely British Columbia's population has grown through international migration. A few folks from other parts of the country are moving here for retirement, but largely the population of BC has remained stagnant this year. And yet our population, although it hasn't been growing, we're seeing significant escalations in property prices. And so that is one of the challenges that we're certainly finding in and around this whole Shuswap riding, and I'm sure Vernon's likely the same, is that the availability of housing is really becoming a problem. Now, there's many ways that we can fix that. The current government had a very bold affordable housing plan. They announced back in 2017 their plan to build 114,000 new residential units of affordable housing over a 10-year plan. So, if we just looked at that's about 11,400 units a year. Unfortunately, here we are, 4 years into that plan, and they've only delivered a very small fraction of that actual housing stock. So, that's one of the challenges. We know that increasing supply certainly helps, is one of the areas that we can assist with that. But the other piece is there's a lot of businesses or individuals that are reluctant to actually rent their properties out. I've heard from many constituents that the strength of the residential tenancy branch is such that it's been very challenging for those that have renters that may be tardy or behind on payment. And it's difficult to get them out. So what I'm seeing in and around the Shuswap, and part of this conversation, I think, has to do with, obviously the tourism values we have here, but many people are opting, instead of renting their houses out on an annualized basis, just Airbnb-ing them. And so renting them out for a very short amount of time. And that takes away from the availability of year-round residential units for our workforce. So, there's many avenues that can be undertaken, both by the provincial government and also by municipalities to try and increase the availability of rental stock. So that's, one of the, probably the prime area of concern that I'm hearing in and around the Shuswap communities right now.
Yeah, certainly it would seem that a lot of workers, especially in the labor industry, are being priced out of the market and being able to live here. So yeah, so more affordable housing would certainly help combat that. Just to remind people, if you have questions, please submit them. Oh, here's an anonymous question that came through. So does the official opposition feel a certain percentage of community immunization lead to a full reopening of business and operations? Why is there not a push for regional regulations rather than provincial decrees?
Yeah, so very good question. And I think a lot of this, as we spoke earlier, just about clarity and the data and the information that's provided. There's a number of news articles just coming out in the last few days where the prevalence of the P1 variant is estimated to be significantly higher than what's actually reported. One of the challenges that I think many of us have, both in business and individuals, is having a better understanding of where the outbreaks actually are occurring. And so there's really a lack of data. If you go to Ontario's public health website, there's a significant of additional data that's made available. Whereas in BC, for some reason, they're actually withholding much of the information. And so it's really hard to have a better understanding of where the outbreaks are. And without having that good understanding of where those outbreaks are, the challenge, I think, is that for many of us, where does government, or where does Chief Medical Officer Bonnie Henry, where does she actually start looking at proper use or deployment of some of the vaccines? In the Shuswap area, we've got a number of small communities. As I mentioned, I live in Sicamous, community of about 3,500 people. We're about 20 minutes from Salmon Arm. It's been identified as a small, rural, remote community, and anybody over the age of 18, and Sicamous, as an example, can actually register to get inoculated with the vaccine. That also includes some of the other smaller communities around the area, Anglemont, Scotch Creek, Falkland. Some of those small communities are providing an opportunity to get the vaccines earlier than the general population. And so, I think government needs to provide a bit more understanding to the average British Columbian on what is it that's actually driving some of these decisions. As we know, they've just now opened it up for those age 71 and older. And yet, if you happen to reside in a small community at the age of 18, you can actually jump the queue and get inoculated before somebody in their 70s. And I'm not really sure what the logic or the rationale is behind that. And so, hopefully government can be a little bit more clear in providing, the constituents and residents of British Columbia with a better understanding of what thought process is going behind that. As far as when there will be an adequate number of people vaccinated to open up, I'm certainly not an epidemiologist. Chief Medical Officer Bonnie Henry, I think, has done a great job, largely for the most part, on directing us to this point. But there's going to be additional scrutiny in the months ahead as we try and look to summer and what reopening might look like. And that's the one challenge for so many businesses, is the uncertainty. If you have many of the summer camps, Sunnybury Bible Camp, for example, there's really no indication to them whether they'll even be able to operate this year. And so, if the decision is made 2 months hence from now to actually allow them to reopen, there won't be enough time for them to actually do the proper marketing in order to fully operate. So, I'm hoping that as we look at this recovery and restart program, that government can actually provide a bit more certainty with respect to how we might see the province open back up for additional commerce. Keeping in mind, of course, that if we see increasing escalation of cases, that timeline may change. But to leave everybody in the dark, not knowing until they take the stage and make an announcement, it's very difficult for many of our tourism-related businesses to have any certainty when they don't know until the announcement's actually made.
Yeah, obviously the number of cases that we have here in the interior are much fewer than they are on the coast. So in your opinion, Greg, like, should we have a region to region approach to health orders and restrictions based on for businesses?
Yeah, I certainly believe so. It's something that we've been asking for. It has been done in other parts of the country, but there seems to have been a hesitancy. I can see from a communication standpoint, it's nice to just have one message for the entire province, but our province is so diverse, both geographically and with respect to the amount of migration and interprovincial travel that different areas may be receiving. And so, I'm certainly seeing that both the media and the general population seem to be looking for a more regionalized approach, and I'm hoping that government will turn their mind towards that in the months ahead.
Gotcha. Kim Hutton had a comment here. She says, I was surprised when she booked a COVID vaccination appointment for her 78-year-old father, and the wait time was 3 to 4 weeks out. I'm not sure if this is a question, but it says the timeline that the province is giving everyone based on booking appointments, or is it actual vaccinations?
Yeah, so as we know, they just yesterday was the first day opening up the online vaccination registration portal, which is fantastic. This was needed months ago. I'm happy to see that it's finally come out, and I have seen some reporting of folks that have gone online to register and said that it was pretty seamless, didn't take a whole bunch of time. But I think we also have to ask the question, when COVID hit our doorsteps last year, I would have assumed that government, with the tens of thousands of bureaucrats, would have put together a team to start looking, even back in the early days of COVID, what recovery might look like, what tools would we need as we look to vaccinate the population of the province. It seems to have been left to the absolute last minute. We didn't have a provincial response. We had the individual health authorities kind of having or making it up kind of on the fly. Some health authorities had an online registration system. Some health authorities did not. We're now finally seeing, after all of the challenges that people experienced in trying to book their appointment, now we finally see this online registry. But I think that, the question to government is, why wasn't this made available 4 months ago? We certainly don't have to have the vaccines available for people to register. The registration process, as far as making sure we had the data on all those that were looking to become vaccinated, as well as their date of birth, all those that sort of information could have been compiled months ago, which would have really taken a lot of the stress and anguish away from this current process that we find ourselves in.
Thanks. You touched on this a little bit earlier in your opening statement about the numbers with tourism, but COVID has hit the tourism and accommodation industries particularly hard. What more can be done to ensure that these businesses can maintain cash flow and not close before the economic recovery returns?
Yeah, well, there's, obviously getting our population vaccinated and getting back to normal as soon as possible. That's, should be top of mind for government. And I appreciate that the availability of vaccine, although that's federal, the federal government, I think, announced this morning, I read an article indicating the feds are indicating there's 400,000 vaccinations in BC that have yet to actually reach people's arms. So, the federal government, I think, needs to do more on providing those vaccines, making them available to all provinces. Provinces, I think, could do a better job across Canada and increasing the time frame, or reducing the time frame it takes to actually get people inoculated. But the other thing is the business supports, and that's the one area where, we touched on earlier with the significant delay of getting the money into the hands of struggling small businesses. $5 billion COVID recovery program was actually approved last March, and yet it took until towards the end of September before the Restart program, that $350 million funding program, to actually even be announced. And, as I mentioned again, here we are with only 40% of the money out the door. The announcement of the program is fantastic, but it does not do benefit. It doesn't help people with meeting payroll. It doesn't help businesses trying to keep up with their ongoing payments during this pandemic. It's of no benefit to them until the money is actually out the door. And so, although we have been advocating on the side of small business and trying to increase, the pressure, encouraging government to increase the opportunity of getting those necessary funds out the door sooner, we're still really slow in getting dollars out. And just in overall dollars, The funds that are actually also going out the door to help small businesses here in British Columbia is significantly lower than it is in other jurisdictions around Canada. So, I think just the timing and the opportunity of getting the funds out, and then also looking at the parameters. Many small businesses in our province, especially tourism related, are seasonal. They don't have a lot of income during the months of January, February, March. April's typically when they get started up. But one of the criteria for the current COVID restart funding program is they have to actually show revenues in the months of March and April. And for many businesses, by default, they're not even eligible to make application. And so, it's unfortunate that government appears to be picking winners and losers and putting any seasonal businesses at a distinct disadvantage to others. And I think in the Shuswap region, where we're really reliant on our tourism sector, I think that particular program puts this area, Shuswap Okanagan, at a distinct disadvantage.
Hey, thanks, Greg. There was a question that came in through the Q&A that I will ask. So why is there not more investment in British Columbia to attract industry rather than simply selling our resources overseas just for those materials to be returned to Canada as furniture and plastics, for instance? With lumber so expensive and building costs so high, why are we allowing resources to go overseas when we cannot build affordable housing at home?
Yeah, so that's a big question. Obviously, BC is very wealthy in natural resources, and it has been the mainstay of our economy, for going on 100 years. Whether we're talking the mining sector, forestry, oil and gas, all very important commodities and contributors to our provincial economy. When we talk about value added, specifically like with the forest sector, that's something that was front and foremost of the BC Jobs Plan. We were always having a look at how we could actually maximize the value of our forest products that are actually manufactured and turned into lumber here in the province. But there's also other challenges when it comes to different geographic areas. So, I'm sure that the comment in part was talking about some of our raw log exports or unprocessed logs that many people talk about. The challenge is that for many areas of the province, and it's mostly the coast, that's where the large majority of fiber is actually shipped offshore. It has to be first made available on the Canadian market before they can actually get approval to export. So for people that think that logs might just be processed and sold overseas without the opportunity to sell it first into the Canadian market, that is not correct. It's for our federal exports, obviously the federal government has to be made aware, and those logs have to be made available first in the Canadian market before they can actually get approval to ship overseas. What ends up happening for many parts of the coast, where the cost of harvesting our fiber is extremely expensive, you got very mountainous areas, the cost of building roads in order to get access to that fiber is very expensive. They actually need to have the revenues associated with the logs that are actually shipped overseas. They need that additional revenue in order to help subsidize, in essence, the cost of actually getting access to much of that fiber. So to think that by canceling log exports would somehow increase the local supply, it largely wouldn't. What we'd end up seeing is just an overall reduction in processing overall. But there's many things that we can do. When we talk about attracting capital investment to our province, one of the most important things that we need to look at is our competitiveness as a jurisdiction. And so what we have seen over the last 4 years under the current government, we've seen increases to the corporate tax rate. We've had a significant increase with labor cost on account of the new employer health tax, adding approximately 2% cost to many businesses that are major employers in and around the region. And these are taxes that don't exist in the same format in neighboring jurisdictions. So if we go to Alberta as an example, the corporate tax rate in Alberta is 8%. In British Columbia, it is now 12%. So, just think about that for a second. The corporate tax rate, the provincial corporate tax rate in British Columbia is 50% higher than it is in our neighboring province of Alberta. Alberta is a province that does not have provincial sales tax. It does not have an employer health tax. They have not had the same pressure on the minimum wage rate that we've had here in BC. So, it's convenient, I think, for government to look to just adding additional taxes on the backs of BC businesses, but it does come at a cost. And that's the one piece that, I certainly believe that government is failing to have a look at, is where is our competitiveness with respect to other jurisdictions, around North America, both to our immediate neighbors to the east, as well as many of our trading partners south of the border. So that's it's one of the areas that I think government needs to certainly turn their mind to, is providing the necessary tools and the support so that BC businesses can compete on a global stage and not be disadvantaged or handcuffed by high taxation.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. Just pivoting back to, again, COVID and the recovery here. So casinos, cinemas, and professional performance venues remain closed after a year, impacting employees and revenue streams. What measures are needed to reopen these businesses in a safe manner?
Yeah, there's a sector that has been absolutely just decimated. If you have a look at casinos and movie theaters, their revenues have gone from 100% to zero. There's been no middle ground, unlike many sectors where they could open under set conditions. So, it's definitely a concern. One of the things that we have been asking government and lobbying for is for them to actually expand the COVID restart funding to allow many of these organizations to actually make application. Many of the arts facilities and that were actually cut out, and they were ineligible to actually make application to that $350 million program. So that's one of the areas that we're hoping government will continue to look to expand the criteria and the eligibility requirements, so that for some of those sectors that they can actually have access to government funding through these very challenging times. And then the other piece, again, it comes back to the raw data. I'm sure that Dr. Bonnie Henry has the best interests of all British Columbians at heart, but I know that there are increasing questions and challenges coming from people around the province about, how is it that it's justifiable and valid for 350 vehicles to be in a Walmart parking lot or at a Home Hardware or a Costco, but if you go to a drive-in movie theater, somehow you can't have any more than 50 vehicles at an actual maximum limit. And so, I think those are the questions that start coming up, and I'm sure that government have answers and they can provide some rationale. Unfortunately, many of the decisions are not backed up with the actual raw data. So British Columbians are left kind of just hoping that government's doing the right thing without actually being provided the data that would allow us to make our own determinations on whether, this is the correct policy at that particular time. But, again, our biggest hope for economic recovery is going to be getting as many people vaccinated as soon as we possibly can. And that's really where I think the focus is of government at the moment.
Yeah, thanks. I'll just remind people again, if you have questions, please submit them through the Q&A and chat. But speaking about, Bonnie Henry and health authorities, what role do you think health authorities should have in reopening the economy?
Yeah, so I think as we look at a regional approach, I certainly believe that there needs to be that oversight of our Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Bonnie Henry. But, in my view, I think that I certainly have confidence in Interior Health here in the local region. They have a lot better understanding of what's actually happened on a localized level. And so, although there may be overarching policies that are set by our Chief Medical Officer, I certainly don't see why they would not provide that latitude for the different health authorities to make adjustments or other considerations, or to take into account other considerations that may stray somewhat from a provincial directive. But, far for me to say that's something for the province to decide. But I think if we are going to look at more of a regional opening, it only makes good sense that to allow for that to happen, there's going to be more say for the actual health authorities directly looking after, our medical system and healthcare workers and managing our hospitals at a local level. I think that there's going to have to be a relaxation or that opportunity for the individual health authorities to have a bigger say with respect to how we're moving forward.
Right. Well, I have one more question from the chamber specifically. So yeah, just if anybody else has more questions, I'd be happy to forward those on to Greg so we can ask them. But what steps should be taken to improve public access to affordable mental health and addiction services closer to home?
Yeah, this is a huge topic. We are just, I think this next month, coming up on the 5-year anniversary of when we first issued the public health or provincial health emergency order with respect to the opioid crisis. And what we have certainly seen in the last 5 years, although there was some effort to see those numbers actually going down from 2016, 17, 18, COVID has changed all of that. And we are now sitting on numbers where the death toll in British Columbia is almost double, twice as many people dying of opioid and overdose crisis now as they were 5 years ago when the provincial state of emergency was first put in place. Some of the stats, Canadian Mental Health Association, approximately 50% of everybody, of all people in our province, will suffer some form of mental health challenge by the age of 40. So, we'll all be impacted either directly or know somebody close to us that actually deals with it. The Canadian Mental Health Association certainly has done a lot of work over the last number of years to reducing stigma and helping with folks, both in the provision of awareness campaigns and then actually providing services, at a more local level. From the provincial standpoint, there's obviously much more that can be done. Government, certainly the current government, when they were in opposition, had all the answers. They were pretty hard on the government of the day with respect to the work that was being done around mental health and addictions. They felt so strongly that in forming government, they actually, for the first time in our province's history, have a ministry dedicated to mental health and addictions. And yet, if we actually look at the statistical data, even though there is a dedicated ministry, they've got a very small budget, and we haven't actually seen the improvements. And it's like very convenient, whether we're talking about the economy or opioid crisis or even just mental health in general, to blame COVID. And I certainly appreciate that COVID has a significant impact, but that doesn't take away the responsibility of government to be continuing to make gains in those areas. If we look at many of those folks that are homeless and on our streets, many, I think 70%, have some form of underlying mental health condition. And, as we look to going forward, we need to, identify the cause and then work with folks to prevent the harm. And that's not just providing a bed for people to sleep in, it's also ensuring that all of the necessary supports, having nurses on call, having the availability for psychologists, and also for treatment. The opioid crisis obviously has taken more lives, I believe, this last year than COVID-19, and yet there has not been the same level of effort and dollars going into trying to help to solve that. So, lots of work to be done. I'm not saying it's easy, but I certainly don't see the current government of really winning on this file. But I certainly also appreciate that it's very challenging.
Yeah, thanks, Greg Kyllo. I appreciate that. I don't see any more questions coming through via the chat or the Q&A. So we'll just give you an opportunity if you'd like to touch on anything else, give your closing statement.
Dan, I want to thank you again very much for this opportunity, and thanks for Richard for helping to set this up. It's always a great opportunity to take a few questions. As an MLA for the Shuswap region, it's hard to be an expert on all topics that might come forward, but certainly I'm an entrepreneur at heart. Definitely have lots of support for the business sector. And so, as we look at some of the challenges with government, and this is a very trying time for sure, governments have choices. And so, it's one of those things that, we need to be kind of cognizant of, is that, what choices is government making and how does that help specifically with the organization, Dan, that you represent? How are these efforts or the efforts of government helping to support small business? Are they adding additional cost pressures to businesses at a time when they need help, or are they actually providing relief? I was really surprised last year to see the minimum wage rate increase in June of last year, increased about 17%. In the height of a pandemic, at a time when businesses were struggling, having a very tough time just keeping their doors open, largely minimum wage largely impacts the tourism hospitality sector, the sector that was largest hit. But despite there being a pandemic, government charged ahead and moved forward with increasing the minimum wage. Minimum wage rate is also expected to increase also this year in June. We've seen an increase in the corporate tax. We had the new employer health tax, which was a very drastic departure from what government or the NDP had announced in their election platform about the elimination. There was no elimination of the medical services premiums. They've simply replaced it with a new form of taxation, taking it from the individual and putting that cost burden directly right onto the backs of BC businesses. That's about $1.9 billion a year of new taxation. So, it all comes back to the whole competitiveness piece. And so one of the areas that, as my Critic portfolio with responsibility for labor, that I'm keeping a fairly close mind to, is what is government doing on the labor front. We fully anticipate in this current legislative session, we'll likely see a move, and government has put this actually in their mandate letter to look at expanding and bringing back compulsory trades training in the province. And we can debate at length about the merits, the pros and cons of that. But the other piece is they certainly have not been shy about indicating their desire to remove the secret ballot. And I think if we look at one of the most significant tenets of democracy is the right to have that secret ballot, to be able to make a decision without the pressure or the scrutiny of your working peers. And so that was something the current government was trying to bring forward a couple of years back. They did not have the support of the Green Party at the time, and so they didn't actually move forward with introducing that legislation. But there has been lots of rumors and musings, both by Premier John Horgan, as well as the Minister of Labour, Harry Bains, that there is consideration of actually removing the secret ballot. And I think that would be a very backward step for the province. One of the other areas that impact the Shuswap riding has to do with what the government is coining their community benefit agreement. And so for those of you that may not be familiar with it, government announced that both for the construction of the Patullo Bridge replacement project in Vancouver and for the construction of or expansion of Highway 1, Trans-Canada Highway 4 laning, that these projects would be required to actually work through a new Crown Corporation, BCIB, that the NDP government had put forward, which requires and mandates mandatory union sign up and registration for any workers that are working on these projects. What it effectively does, only 15% of the construction trade in British Columbia is currently unionized, with the large majority, 85%, working in open shop or ununionized construction projects in our province. So this new policy that the NDP put forward basically indicates that for any small business that might want to bid on a highway construction project, they're actually required to actually join one of the 19 select unions that John Horgan and his cabinet have actually identified, specifically excluding many of the progressive unions. So Christian Labour Association of Canada and Canada West and a number of other progressive unions have actually been cut out and not even provided an opportunity to participate. And so what's happening is that we're seeing a reduced number of companies bid on these highway expansion projects, and it's driving the costs up. Just got a couple examples here. One particular project, this was the first project in our province on the Highway 1 construction project that actually fell under this new CB requirement. So this was a project that was originally announced back in 2015. I was actually proud to make the announcement. It was 2.5 kilometers of four laning. The project was called Illecillewaet. It's about 46 kilometers east of Revelstoke. There's a big brake check area there. So they were looking at doubling the size of the brake check and 2.5 kilometers of four laning. When we made that announcement, I made that with David Wilkes, then former MLA for the Columbia region. It was pegged at $35 million. The province was in for 19.5 million. The feds were in for 15.5. In 2019, the NDP re-announced that same project. So this is a project, 2.5 kilometers, 35 million. They re-announced that same project. This is again the first CBA project. They re-announced that project. They've reduced it from 2.5 kilometers to 2.2 kilometers, but increased the budget for it from 35 million to $62.9 million with no additional funding coming from the feds. They put that project out to tender, and on May 16th, they actually awarded the contract. They further reduced it from the original 2.5 kilometers to 2.1 kilometers at a whopping price tag of $85.2 million. Now, that's 257% more than the original budget estimate that was put forward back in 2015. So there's a significant cost to taxpayers, and it's really disrespectful to taxpayers. And again, it cuts out 85% of construction workers. Another project right here in Salmon Arm, the Salmon Arm West Highway construction project. That project was originally announced. I announced it in 2016 with then Minister of Transportation, Todd Stone. The project at the time was 6.1 kilometers at a cost of 162.7 million. The project now has increased in cost by $20 million, but they've cut the project roughly in half. Instead of getting 6.1 kilometers of four laning for 162.7 million, they're spending $20 million more for only 3.3 kilometers. They've canceled the entire third phase of the project. So, you know, I think that governments have choices to make, and unfortunately, they seem to be discriminatory in nature, that are providing a lot of support to a lot of the large building trade unions. And I certainly have a lot of support. I don't have any trouble with unions whatsoever. But where is the respect for the taxpayer? Any project that goes to tender, it should be the lowest bid, and there should be not be the bidders should not be handcuffed by what I would say would be more policy or even political calculations of the government on where they would like to see the dollars flow. Because again, you know, as evidence on just those two projects, significant cost overruns at the disrespect, I think, of 85% of construction workers in the province that choose not to unionize for one reason or another.
Less for more does seem a little bit backwards, and I'm sure that taxpayers wouldn't like to hear that. Yeah, so thanks for sharing that with us, Greg. And I want to thank you, especially for your time today. Yeah, it's been 55 minutes, and thank you for coming on board and sharing your message and your thoughts with the Greater Vernon Chamber of Commerce members and stakeholders throughout the region. Yeah, you don't have to be here, so I want to make sure that people know that. Thank you very much. We do appreciate it. I want to thank all our members who joined us today and for your thoughtful questions and concerns that you raised. And as the Greater Vernon Chamber, we're proud to be able to host and facilitate these opportunities for you to do so and continue to advocate on your behalf. So thank you everyone again for attending, and hopefully we'll be able to do one of these again in the near future. So thanks again, Greg.
Yeah, thanks again.
Take care, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.